Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Saturday everybody. I hope you've had an eventful week, and I hope you're now enjoying a restful weekend. It is the weekend, so as usual we have a foreign policy and diplomacy heavy episode, and today we will focus on developments in US-China relations. In the previous 2 videos we touched on the ongoing technology war between the 2 powers, as well as China's preparations earlier in the week for a potential conflict with the US or a US-led coalition. Today we examine other developments in this space. It's normally a more core audience that watches on a Saturday too, so I feel like in these videos we can really take our time to unpack deep and salient themes. It's a pleasure to have these longer form videos with you all. If you get some value from today's episode, don't forget to hit the like button. Sharing and subscribing is a big help, especially if you want to be on top of the most up-to-date China analysis when it's released. We are about 120 away from 74,000 subscribers. It would be awesome if we could reach this over the weekend, putting the milestone of 75,000 within reach for this month. With all that said, let's jump in. This week, US Secretary of State Blinken and top PRC diplomat Wang Yi met in Laos during the foreign ministers' meeting of the 31st Asian Regional Forum. Based on the PRC readout, it seems like it was an especially candid discussion, to put it mildly. Wang appears to be blunt with his language, expressing to his American counterpart, quote, "The US has not stopped, but rather doubled down on its containment and suppression of China. The risks facing US-China relations are still building, and the challenges rising," end quote. Wang also, according to the official PRC readout of the meeting, quote, pointed out that the US side holds a wrong perception of China, always seeing China with its own hegemonic mindset. China is not the United States, nor does China want to become like the United States. China does not pursue hegemony or practice power politics, end quote. Of course, regular viewers know that Beijing has long expressed a desire to build a new global order based on Chinese values and systems, couched in rhetoric of a peaceful rise and promising to be more inclusive of the so-called global south, though India, the world's largest developing country, is conspicuously absent from these articulations. All its various territorial tensions with neighbors, Vietnam, the Philippines, Taiwan, Japan, India, etc., are presented as defensive measures to protect Chinese sovereignty, and not aggressive attempts of a rising power to change the status quo, as some of these would view it. As Wang Yi stated in his meeting, quote, "China has the best record on peace and security among all major countries. We will stay committed to our founding aspiration and focus on seeking happiness for the Chinese people, the rejuvenation of the Chinese race. China will stay on the path of peaceful development and promote the building of a community with a shared future for mankind," end quote. According to the US readout, Secretary of State Blinken, quote, reiterated serious concern with PRC support for Russia's defense industrial base and made clear that if the PRC does not act to address this threat to European security, the United States will continue to take appropriate measures to do so, end quote, suggesting that more sanctions are coming. According to a State Department official speaking to US-based The New York Times, in their meeting, Wang listened to Blinken's criticisms, but said that China has not sent weapons to Russia. Blinken told Wang that defending Ukraine against Russia's aggression was a core interest of the United States, using a term that Chinese officials often deploy to signal their own national priorities. State media has been pushing Ukraine stories as it relates to the US-China dynamics heavily this week too. In a commentary this week called "Using the Ukraine Crisis to Smear China Exposes Hypocrisy and Double Standards," for example, party mouthpiece The People's Daily told its millions of readers, quote, "We advise the United States and NATO to reflect on the root causes of the Ukraine crisis and their own actions, and to take practical steps to ease the situation, rather than shifting blame and scapegoating others. Recently, US politicians have baselessly hyped up claims that China supports Russia's defense industry and threatens to intensify sanctions on specific Chinese entities and individuals. Under US leadership, NATO has also falsely claimed that China is a decisive factor in the Ukraine crisis. On the issue of the Ukraine crisis, the US and NATO's rhetoric about China's responsibility not only fails to cover up the fact that the US and NATO's continuous fueling of the conflict has prolonged the crisis, but also makes it clear to the international community that the US and NATO's obsession with provoking bloc confrontations is a major security threat to the world. The US and NATO's rhetoric about China's responsibility in the Ukraine crisis hides a sinister plot, with an important goal being to sow discourse in China-Europe relations and undermine China-Europe cooperation. Ukraine is located at the heart of the European continent, and the prolonged crisis has put enormous pressure on European countries in terms of politics, economy and security. China is not the creator or party to the Ukraine crisis, and has not and will not fan the flames or profit from the situation. China has always been committed to promoting peace talks, encouraging and supporting all efforts conducive to a peaceful resolution of the crisis, and promoting the construction of a balanced, effective and sustainable European security architecture." End quote. We note that according to Chinese customs data itself, Chinese exports to Russia in 2023 exceeded $111 billion, 67% more than in 2021. And Chinese goods now account for 38% of Russia's imports, while 31% of Russia's exports go to China, both big jumps versus the pre-war years. In 2023, Chinese car exports to Russia rose 594% versus 2021, while exports of trucks and tractors rocketed almost 700%. Meanwhile, this week too, a bipartisan group of US lawmakers announced legislation that would give Washington greater authority to withhold funding from the global body that oversees national drug testing programs, amid reports of Chinese Olympic athletes being cleared after testing positive for performance-enhancing drugs. Back in July, US-based New York Times reported that 2 Chinese swimmers, one of whom is competing at the Paris Olympics, tested positive for an anabolic steroid, a banned performance-enhancing substance, in 2022, but were allowed to continue competing without sanctions after Chinese anti-doping authorities cleared them. Before that, a Times investigation revealed that 23 Chinese swimmers from the Tokyo Olympics in 2021 had tested positive for a banned substance, TMZ, at a training camp months before the Olympics. Chinese anti-doping officials determined that the positive findings resulted from contamination of food the swimmers ate and did not sanction or suspend any of the athletes. Beijing attributed the 2022 tests to hamburgers from a Beijing restaurant. The World Anti-Doping Agency, WADA, which oversees clean sport at major international events like World Championships or the Olympics, agreed with the Chinese group, and the athletes were allowed to compete in Tokyo. This has sparked an ongoing controversy. With a 2023 payment of $3.4 million, the US is the largest donor to the agency. The so-called Restoring Confidence in the World Anti-Doping Agency Act of 2024 would require the US Office of National Drug Control Policy to assess the World Anti-Doping Agency's independence and would give it a permanent authority to withhold voluntary contributions to the agency if independence is found lacking. Bipartisan lawmakers say the ultimate goal of the bill is to empower US agencies to, quote, use all available tools, end quote, to ensure that the global body has, quote, credible and independent governance models, end quote. One lawmaker pushing the bill expressed, quote, while we may not be able to bring the Chinese Communist Party officials responsible for these crimes to justice, we can hold their foreign co-conspirators accountable, end quote, accusing WADA of failing to independently investigate and verify the findings of the Chinese authorities. WADA hit back at the accusations, expressing in a statement this week that it, quote, thoroughly reviewed the cases in early 2024 with all due skepticism and concluded that there was no evidence to challenge contaminated meat as the source of the positive tests and therefore decided not to appeal. The politicization of Chinese swimming continues with this latest attempt by the media in the United States to imply wrongdoing on the part of WADA and the broader anti-doping community, end quote, adding, quote, as we have seen over recent months, WADA has been unfairly caught in the middle of geopolitical tensions between the superpowers, but has no mandate to participate in that, end quote. Next up, earlier this week we covered a long piece discussing Chinese preparations for a potential war with the United States, the so-called fortress economy process. This week also saw the US military analyze its own fighting preparedness with such a contingency. According to a new report published this week by the US Congressional Commission on the National Defense Strategy, the US military, quote, lacks both the capabilities and capacity required to be confident it can deter and prevail in combat, end quote. For more than a year, the former lawmakers, military leaders, and policy experts on the Commission on the National Defense Strategy have studied how well the US military is executing the 2022 National Defense Strategy. The group released their report on Monday and presented its findings to the Senate Armed Services Committee on Tuesday. The group found big gaps between the Defense Department's ambitions of deterring or preventing a major conflict and reality. One of the reasons they came to that conclusion is the current state of US defense industrial base compared to China's. Congress established the Commission on the National Defense Strategy by statute to examine and make recommendations with respect to the National Defense Strategy. The Commission called on RAND to provide administrative and analytical support for this report, and it is a huge report. The first few paragraphs of the executive summary give us a flavor of the concerns therein. Quote, "The threats the United States faces are the most serious and most challenging the nation has encountered since 1945 and include the potential for near-term major war. The United States last fought a global conflict during World War II, which ended nearly 80 years ago. The nation was last prepared for such a fight during the Cold War, which ended 35 years ago. It is not prepared today. China and Russia are major powers that seek to undermine U.S. influence. The 2022 National Defense Strategy recognizes these nations as the top threats to the United States and declares China to be the pacing challenge based on the strength of its military and economy and its intent to exert dominance regionally and globally. The Commission finds that, in many ways, China is outpacing the United States and has largely negated the U.S. military advantage in the Western Pacific through 2 decades of focused military investment. Without significant change by the United States, the balance of power will continue to shift in China's favor. China's overall annual military spending on defense is estimated at as much as $711 billion US, and the Chinese government in March 2024 announced an increase in annual defense spending of 7.2%. China and Russia's no-limits partnership formed in February 2022, just days before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, has only deepened and broadened to include a military and economic partnership with Iran and North Korea, each of which presents its own significant threat to U.S. interests. This new alignment of nations opposed to U.S. interests creates a real risk, if not likelihood, that conflict anywhere could be a multi-theater or global war. China, and to a lesser extent Russia, is using military, diplomatic and industrial strength to expand power worldwide and coerce its neighbors." End quote. The rest of the report is very long, so I have summarized the main points. The US must adopt a comprehensive strategy integrating military, diplomatic, economic and industrial efforts to match and deter adversaries. Current US strategies lack a detailed implementation plan for integrated deterrence. Strengthening alliances in the Pacific and NATO is critical. The US must integrate military and economic efforts with allies to counter China and Russia effectively. DoD's outdated practices and reliance on old hardware hinder its ability to meet current threats. Rapid innovation and adoption of new technologies such as artificial intelligence and hypersonics are essential. The U.S. defense industrial base cannot currently meet the equipment and technological needs of the U.S. and its allies. Increased investment and flexibility in acquisition systems are necessary, along with joint production with allies. Developing innovative joint operational concepts is critical to employ new capabilities effectively. The American public is largely unaware of the dangers and the costs required to adequately prepare. A bipartisan call to arms is needed to make major changes and investments now. A multiple theater force construct is proposed to address the likelihood of simultaneous conflicts in multiple theaters. This construct involves defending the homeland, deterring China in the Western Pacific, leading NATO against Russia, and countering Iranian activities. Addressing recruitment shortfalls and preparing reserve components for potential broader mobilization is necessary. Increased levels of public and civil service are recommended to renew engagement and patriotism. The lack of preparedness stems from years of failure to recognize changing threats and transform the U.S. national security structure. Implementing these recommendations requires sustained leadership and a fundamental change in mindset across the government and among the public. Next up, and finally for today, there has been a lot of debate in the West surrounding which US presidential candidate Beijing would prefer to see in the Oval Office. Trump or Harris. This conversation has been happening within elite circles in Beijing too. This week, Wang Jisi, founding president of the Institute of International and Strategic Studies at China's prestigious Peking University, and Zhao Jianwei and Hu Ran, research associates at the Institute for International and Strategic Studies, co-authored a long piece discussing this very question. It's important for us to get a sense of how the Chinese themselves are debating these ideas, and so we end today's video with an examination of this article. Of course, this is a very Sinocentric perspective that pushes Chinese narratives and discourse objectives, but that is exactly why we need to examine it here. We will notice criticism of US policy without much self-criticism of similar or at times worse Chinese policy or behavior. This is in due part to the restrictions on discourse within China, but also due to the regular bias we all have towards our own system. The piece is still very thoughtful and nuanced, providing much deeper and more thought-provoking food for thought than a boilerplate state media article. Full disclosure, Wang Jisi was one of my professors when I did my master's degree at Peking University. We had many healthy disagreements during my time in his classes. The article has a simple title, Does China Prefer Harris or Trump? It's a long quote from a very long piece, but it is useful to let the authors unpack their ideas. We are now quoting selected excerpts from the piece directly. Over the past few weeks, the upheavals in the US presidential election season have drawn enormous global attention. Many countries seeing an increasingly stark divergence between the anticipated continuation of Biden's internationalist foreign policy under a future President Harris and a far more isolationist approach under a re-elected President Trump and his running mate J.D. Vance. For China, however, the view is somewhat different. 8 years ago, the first Trump administration ushered in a far more confrontational approach to relations with Beijing, which many Chinese observers found bewildering. Rather than treating China as a trading partner and sometimes a rival, the United States began to call it a revisionist power, a strategic competitor, and even a threat. More striking still, despite changes in tone, the Biden administration has reinforced that shift and even taken it further on some issues. Indeed, there seemed to be a bipartisan consensus in Washington that China must now be treated as a major adversary, with a growing contingent of analysts arguing for a Cold War framing. To Chinese observers, rather than offering alternative approaches to their country and the world, the two major US parties both reflect a general approach to China that has emerged in recent years, one that is strongly informed by domestic US political concerns. What is more important than either party's views are the several gradations of US analysis of China and what that could mean in practice. Most Chinese observers do not expect significant changes in US policy towards China, but they are trying to understand which strands of current thinking in Washington may ultimately dominate. Owing to China's political structure and the close government management of Chinese public opinion, it is difficult to fathom how the leadership in Beijing views and reacts to US debate about China. Nevertheless, some general points can be made about the forces that many in China see as driving that debate. First, a country's external actions tend to reflect its domestic politics. This phenomenon appears to be especially true in the US, in which major domestic debates can easily spill over into foreign affairs, and it has come to play a particular role in how Washington approaches China. Thus, both Trump's America First mantra and Biden's foreign policy for the middle class catchphrase vividly demonstrate the close relationship between domestic politics and foreign policy in the United States. After Trump took office, the deeply polarized political climate in the United States shaped its foreign policy, particularly toward China. The America First approach was largely a response to American voters' concerns about globalization and immigration. As a result, the Trump administration raised trade barriers, restricted immigration, and limited U.S. participation in international organizations, prioritizing the United States' economic interests and national security. Yet the Biden administration has also made clear that its foreign policy decisions are aimed to align with the interests of voters at home, and that the prosperity of ordinary Americans also has an international dimension. Thus, Biden's foreign policy shares similar political considerations with Trump's, and it aims to rebalance domestic industrial policies and international economic rules to promote domestic interests.
A second feature of US foreign policy in recent years is the growing role that China plays in it. Although Russia's armed conflict with Ukraine and Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza drew much attention, China continues to be the top priority in Washington's pronounced global strategy. At this critical juncture, many US strategists are renewing calls for Washington to accelerate its pivot to Asia. The importance of China policy has already become clear in the US presidential contest. Both parties are vying to produce the strongest rhetoric about getting tough on Beijing and restricting its global role, and thus points to yet another feature of the American debate about China. In the current US political context, the traditional binary of dubs and hawks cannot capture the complexities of US perceptions of China. Given the broad bipartisan consensus that China poses a major challenge, it is more meaningful to examine the range of policy perspectives that has emerged within this general view. Observed from afar, US strategists on China can be broadly divided into three schools. The first might be called the New Cold Warriors. People in this group believe that the US-China rivalry is a zero-sum game and that Washington and Beijing are engaged in a Cold War that requires even more aggressive tactics from the United States. As former US Deputy National Security Advisor Matt Pottinger and former US Congressman Mike Gallagher argued in Foreign Affairs, the competition with China must be won, not managed. The second school could be described as the competition managers. Contrary to the New Cold Warriors, those in this camp hold the idea that the US-Chinese rivalry is not a zero-sum game, and consequently, that it is essential to have a strategy for coexisting with China. The intellectual origins of this approach can be traced to an article that Kurt Campbell and Jake Sullivan wrote for Foreign Affairs in 2019, before they both joined the Biden administration. As they argued, the contest with China is a condition to be managed rather than a problem to be solved. Along with Rush Doshi, who was Deputy Senior Director for China and Taiwan Affairs at the National Security Council from 2021 to early 2024, and others, they suggest that Washington's best approach to China is leading with competition, followed by offers of cooperation. The third might be called the accommodationists. Although they share the other school's dislike for China's political system and its global influence, they tend to be more concerned than their counterparts that competition could devolve into confrontation. As prominent figures in this camp, the international relations scholars Jessica Chen Weiss and James Steinberg are against waging a Cold War with China because Cold Wars are inherently dangerous. In their view, Pottinger and Gallagher offer an illusory appeal to victory, because US efforts to bring about change through pressure are as likely to consolidate authoritarian rule as to undermine it. Weiss and Steinberg argue that it is therefore in the interest of both Beijing and Washington to reduce the risk of war and to cooperate on issues of mutual concern, such as climate change and public health. Despite this diversity of opinion, all three schools agree that China poses a significant challenge to the United States. They also concur that US policy toward China needs bipartisan foundations to succeed. Nonetheless, there appear to be no prevailing view in Washington on which approach is best, or on what aspect of the challenge, political, military, economic, or global governance, is most serious. For Beijing, this unsettled debate has meant that it is crucial to understand how these different approaches are influencing US politics, policies, and specifically how they might shape the incoming US administration. Let's turn to the two candidates. Starting with trade, the Trump administration began with punitive tariffs on Chinese imports and then expanded its campaign to include increased scrutiny and restrictions on Chinese investments, tightened high technology export controls, and targeted actions against specific Chinese companies with large overseas presences, such as Huawei. On security issues, the Trump administration also took steps to maintain US supremacy in what strategists now consistently call the Indo-Pacific region, a geographical term that had been used only occasionally earlier. The Trump administration gave Taiwan special security assurances and downplayed the long-standing One China policy, but put new resources into the Quad, the grouping of Australia, India, Japan, and the United States, in an effort to collectively balance China, and stepped up US military activities in the Western Pacific to challenge China's territorial claims. As for the political relationship between the United States and China, Trump did not hold rigidly ideological views on the Chinese system and leadership, but he allowed his administration officials and the US Congress to stridently criticize China's ruling party and its domestic governance, particularly its policies towards Xinjiang and Hong Kong, and his administration adopted a broader China threat narrative. It severely damaged the academic, scientific, and societal exchanges between the two countries that had existed for decades. Then in 2020, amid a complicated election year in the United States, the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic accelerated the downward spiral of relations between Washington and Beijing. The Trump administration blamed the public health crisis on the Chinese government, suspended most bilateral dialogues, and adopted a hostile stance towards China itself. Yet overall, the Trump administration maintained a degree of flexibility toward China. Despite its punitive tariffs and other measures, it remained open to trade talks and demonstrated some willingness to compromise on thorny issues such as technological competition and Taiwan. For all its supposed differences from the Trump administration, the Biden administration has shown notable continuity with its predecessor on China. Mainly, Biden has cemented the generally adversarial orientation of Trump-era policies by way of a more systematic and multilateral approach, which his administration has called invest, align, and compete. In his first foreign policy speech in February 2021, Biden called China the United States' most serious competitor and pledged to take on directly the challenges it posed to the US, prosperity, security, and democratic values. Thus, Biden has worked closely with Congress to implement large-scale infrastructure investments and industrial policies aimed at making the United States more competitive and less reliant on China. To better compete on advanced technologies, the Biden administration has also sought tighter export controls, new tariffs on China's green technology products, and more coordinated international efforts, such as the Chip 4 Alliance, a semiconductor partnership between Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and the United States. In the Asia-Pacific, the Biden administration has intensified its military presence in the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea, and added a regional economic dimension to the United States' ASEAN security alliances. Biden also rallied G7 leaders to push forward the Build Back Better World Initiative and the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, both aimed at providing a Western answer to China's Belt and Road Initiative. Prompted by China's growing ties with Russia amid the war in Ukraine, the Biden administration has imposed sanctions on Chinese companies that trade with Russia. Washington has also given the contest with China a new overlay of ideology, what the administration calls democracy versus autocracy, in an effort to build a grand alliance against Beijing. Although it has competed fiercely with China, the Biden administration has maintained regular high-level communication channels and continued to explore areas of cooperation. Chinese strategists hold few illusions that U.S. policy towards China might change course over the next decade. Given U.S. public opinion polls and the bipartisan consensus about China in Washington, they assume that whoever is elected in November 2024 will continue to prioritize strategic competition and even containment in Washington's approach to Beijing, with cooperation and exchanges taking a back seat. A new Trump administration would almost certainly pursue a more aggressive trade policy toward China. Trump has already proposed a 60% tariff on all goods manufactured in China, as well as the revocation of China's permanent normal trade relations status, which has granted non-discriminatory favorable trade terms and market access since 2000. Still, given Trump's predilection for deal-making, he might decide to pursue bilateral agreements with Beijing on consumer goods, energy, and technology. He might also try to use the Taiwan issue as a bargaining chip to gain leverage in other areas, such as offering to restrain Taiwan's provocative actions in exchange for Beijing's compromise on trade. It is also highly unlikely that China would agree to such a deal, and Trump's foreign policy advisors might also oppose it. Once again, with his general preference for bilateral diplomacy over multilateralism, Trump might also be less capable of mobilizing allies and partners against China, and might seek a separate U.S. accommodation with Russia, a staunch strategic partner of China. For its part, a Harris administration, assuming it retained much of the Biden approach, would likely intensify strategic competition with Beijing and consolidate Biden's efforts to build a coalition of Western and Asian countries to counterbalance China. Compared with Trump's arbitrary and fickle policymaking, these strategies would likely remain more organized and predictable. Yet, overall, from a Chinese perspective, the China policies of a new Trump administration and a Harris administration would likely be strategically consistent. As presidents, both candidates would present challenges and disadvantages for China, and neither seems likely to want a major military conflict or to cut off all economic and societal contacts. Therefore, Beijing is unlikely to have a clear preference. Like Washington, Beijing's primary concern in 2024 is its domestic situation. Although it seeks stability with Washington, Beijing has also been preparing for growing turbulence in the bilateral relationship. In March 2023, Xi observed, "Western countries led by the United States have implemented all-round containment, encirclement, and suppression against us, bringing unprecedented severe challenges to our country's development." In foreign affairs, Beijing still depicts the world as comprising both developing and developed countries, rather than framing it as Western and anti-Western blocs competing for influence in the global south. China has adamantly resisted US interference in what it regards as its domestic affairs, particularly on issues such as Hong Kong, Taiwan, Tibet, Xinjiang, and human rights. China regards the Taiwan question in particular as holding core importance. In its territorial disputes with the Philippines and the South China Sea, China views its approach as collaborated and confident. In its tensions with the United States over trade and technology, China sees itself focusing on measured counteractions and compelled to double down on pursuing self-reliance. Given the broad similarities of both the Trump and the Biden administration's approach to China, Beijing is preparing itself for the outcome of the US elections with great caution and limited hope. As China continues to prioritize domestic development and security, it will likely strive to defend its economic and governance models while preserving space for global trade and investment. For a long time to come, US-China relations seem unlikely to return to the deep exchanges and cooperation that occurred at the beginning of the 21st century. Yet, if a rapprochement is out of the question, China and the United States can still maintain stability and avoid catastrophe, whoever is in the Oval Office. Here ends the direct quote and today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Have a wonderful weekend, and I will see you all on Monday.